Hello, welcome to Natural Right and History, Chapter 2, Part 2, following Part 1, in which we observed that Max Weber reasoned into the void and found the void, and could not preserve anything but the void, not even reason. And so we're going to look at what he thought that he was left with, because he still tried to preserve science. But Strauss says that there is no real science after you follow the whole logic. And we stopped just short of reaching the real meat and potatoes of the criticism, so we're going to get to that here. The first question is that can a social scientist even differentiate between certain ways of life while totally taking for granted that he has understood the respective values adequately? I first learned this from this idea from Jonathan Pajot, where it's that discerning between categories of scientific inquiry already presupposes some sort of knowledge that isn't exactly scientific. Or translating it to Weberian language, it's an implicit value judgment. And so how can you make that while you're avoiding value? So the example of the future of the West, what is spirituality? I don't know. The question I ask is, can someone devoted to vitalistic values even intellect such things, even if he happens to be living them? How do you know that you're? Let's reason this out, or no, let me not even put it that way. But let's think in terms of the higher. That's what I really mean. Let's approach this commonsensically. How do you? If you're living according to the precepts of a certain religion, how do you know that you're orthodox? You have to know what the religion is. If you don't know, then you don't even. If you're just trying to be devoted to your own life, then you don't really know what your values are, really, except for living passionately or humanly or whatever. So concretely, Strauss questions Weber's assumption of the ability to differentiate between categories, like I said, at all without value judgment. And here's a nod to my friend and teacher Paul Rhodes, which is the question: how can one study art these days if everything's art? It's a disaster. And from what I heard from Strauss, Weber seems to be a guy who teaches very nobly about art, but he has this business of avoiding value judgments. So he's just they're following their demon, right? So he can't really criticize them, even though their teachings are very base, and Weber's seem to be quite noble. But that just seems to be a preference. There's this example of the influence of Puritanism on art, and Strauss asks very bluntly, like, how can you inquire into that if you don't know what Puritanism is or what art is? And Weber seems to have had a pretty good idea of what art is, but that's a value judgment, baby. Or the example of factual description being intellectually dishonest, because one needs value judgments to determine which events were caused by rational actions, for instance. One has to have some sort of standard of well, we'll get into that later, all of this, with some concrete examples that I made up, and which Strauss then also used after I made up that whatever, I'm not going to brag. But one has to understand, and to at least some extent use the standards of other people, or have that other people have or have had, in order to understand their responses to situations. So again, Puritanism and art. You have to know what people thought art was, and then you have to know what Puritanism is, and what it is in Puritanism that made people think that certain things in art were bad or had to be changed, or whatever. I'm not too sure what the influence is of Puritanism on art, but there you have it. And he says it very beautifully. He's trying to soften the value judgment is taking advantage of common sense while denying that common sense is valid. So he makes a sort of draws a sort of picture of Weber playing some sort of childish game where you're like saying, they're like, don't say this word. So he's like making these what'd you say, roundabout sort of formulations and scare quotes, and it's all very petty, I suppose, or at least it is to Strauss anyway. And but Strauss says something interesting, which is that he says that it might be more interesting to study history in light of its values than in terms of Weberian causation, which is cool, and I suppose I sort of agree in a sense. If you really want to understand the world, then you have to look into what people have thought about it, and and then alone, of course, can you actually understand what the influence of these ideas were, and then you can judge them also. Don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid to judge those influences. But he then says something I understand to mean that expressing value judgments is more of a matter of good writing than it is of sound social science, which is interesting. I really have to think about that for a second. So let's do that now. Let's say that I'm describing Soviet Russia, for instance, and I say, this was a horrific tyranny. And I will have made certain value judgments there, but they're not unsound. Let's be honest. There you can certainly reason from all sorts of different perspectives and reach that conclusion. It's not bad of me to say that. But I have to be selective in making those sorts of expressions. So if I do that sort of stuff too often, then it becomes more of a matter of self-expression, which isn't sound writing. When you're trying to write seriously, you don't want to express yourself. You also want to express an idea. You want to express the truth, and then that doesn't. You get sort of. I don't know whether I should say this because I might contradict myself on this very point, so I won't do it. But yeah, suffice it to say that if you want to write seriously and write well, then you're going to have to avoid sounding like a rabid ideologue. I suppose that's what that might mean, but I really don't know for sure. Anyway, the contemporary sociologist, on the one hand, imposes an alien rationality on this subject, while at the same time taking the claims of historical agents for granted. So that's something that would be avoided if value judgments were made explicit in the method and in the writing. So, for instance, we call ancient Greece a culture. These people were living in a culture, and they made up this religion, and they made up this philosophy, and all of that sort of stuff. But we take for granted that the sophists were philosophers, for instance, and we project that onto Plato's Apology, maybe, and then Xenophon's Apology, which is Descartes or whatever. But you can see how that might be problematic. It's sort of, on the one hand, you're sort of answering certain questions for them, while on the other hand you're taking their answers for granted in a way that's not useful. So the sociologist must indeed avoid prejudice in interpreting historical data. So none of this culture business, please, so that he can understand other people. But he needs to interpret the facts according to a frame of reference. And of course, this needs to be a frame of reference according to reason. And it takes some time to figure that out, maybe, but that's what social science would take if it were possible. So taking Greek thought as an example, one cannot do away with all of these ancient authors as expressing, prevailing prejudices in their time, but one must understand their doctrines in order to see any kind of genuine influence, one way or another, while also keeping in mind whether the findings conform to what one is actually studying. So Socrates' case, continuing my earlier example, becomes remarkable and better understood when one sees that he's not an intellectual, and this also leads one to understand why others thought that his life was remarkable. One can see the intentions of Plato in his writings a lot better, and hence give a more lucid account of his influence on later authors and their influence on, say, the Church Fathers and John Locke, Western civilization and so on. Hold on, excuse me. I can tell my throat is being torn to shreds already. And Strauss next criticizes Weber's objectivity. Namely, that he has this frame where there's these three types of governmental legitimacy. But this is a very particular frame. Namely, this has roots in the French Revolution, he explains, which understood legitimacy, of course, as a problem between reason and tradition, which was their whole fixation, which Weber apparently thought to be completed by the addition of charisma. And such a scheme can hardly be considered comprehensive, of course, because it's an incomplete particular scheme that, according to Weber's own reasoning, would not be valid per se. And then he adds one thing, probably without explaining it, and then he just uses it. That's what it seems to me from what Strauss says. Again, I haven't read the Weber guy, but so it's the revolutionary fixation on reason plus Weber's fixation on following demons, which is to say charisma. Now Strauss also uses Plato as an example. One cannot understand Plato's influence if one assumes him to be an intellectual, like I said before. Like a modern author, like a modern author. So as the Republic as really like being a set of concrete policy proposals, which is something that I encountered when I went to university, and people mocked me for praising the Republic. like yeah, including eugenics, right? Yeah, you're an idiot. Yeah. Even though they're probably also eugenicists in their own weird way. But anyway, so Max Weber regarded as essential, continuing with the whole notes, regarded as essential that in a historical phenomenon which is most valuable to the observer or what accounts for its greatest influence. And Strauss explains through the examples of Plato, and particularly Calvin, how this is mistaken and even not totally applied to Weber. After all, using the example of Calvinism, how could Weber understand that Calvin had no personal capitalistic ideology without differentiating between his doctrine and the way others treated it? So, with other words, between orthodoxy and heresy, which is an example that I used before, or between philosophy and intellectuals and all that sort of stuff. And there's a long footnote on Weber's Kantianism on this page that further problematizes his analysis of Calvin. Namely, by identifying, this is the Kantianism, by identifying moral duty and end in itself, thus blurring the final reason why someone might have thought that acquiring wealth was good, namely that it's good to a certain end rather than simply good, while also differentiating between this conglomeration and the common good, hence judging the latter to be base, because it's not a moral imperative according to his scheme, seeing as in his scheme the common good is not the same as true moral good, which is the personal ethical imperative. Hence acquiring wealth for the sake of common good will be utilitarian, which is of course the belief in the total equivalence of moral good and common good, even though no one would have argued at that time that money is an absolute moral good or anything, or at least the Calvinists certainly wouldn't have, or at least not the Orthodox ones. I'm not too familiar with the issue. I don't really care, honestly. But Strauss then makes an argument that is frankly too complex for me to reproduce, but it comes down to the general effect that if Weber had paid less attention to chronology and causation, and more to, you could say, conceptual differences between different theological and philosophical traditions, he would have been able to produce a better account of the origin of capitalism, namely in modernist philosophy, which was adopted a bit more readily by recent branches of Christianity because they also broke more radically with Greek antiquity than the other churches had done, namely the Orthodox and Catholic traditions. So now Strauss comes to the climax of this point, which is that you can't call a spade if you do not accept the premises by which a spade can be identified as a spade. The whole idea of rejecting common sense while also making use of its benefits doesn't work. But Strauss goes further. It is not clear from even the initial value judgment that Weber made as to what constitutes corrupted Calvinism, because it's not immediately clear whether this doctrine was valuable to begin with. Perhaps capitalism is Calvinism without superstition, rather than a carnal interpretation of a spiritual doctrine, as Calvin apparently put it. It's corruption. Like, what is that? What does that imply? What's better? Peterson, what's good? What's better? What's worse? What does that point at? And that's the point that Weber also despairs over, whether secular society or the Bible can be preferable by reason. If not, then the vulgar Calvinism would be no more important than orthodox capitalism. So Adam Smith could be your Bible. The possibility of value judgment remains key, but Weber denies it. So, yeah, right. I should make funny hand gestures while I do these so you don't get bored. So why does Weber think that he can deny value judgment? And Strauss's first answer is that Weber is a modernist. He follows Machiavelli's premise of, of inevitability of moral transgression in politics, and remarks in this regard that Weber puts peace in scare quotes. So that's quite something. So how does that mean? How does that mean you can't do value judgment? Well, because the ideal regime wouldn't be possible, because you have to break rules all the time. And seeing as Weber does not believe in true knowledge, which is what that really amounts to, he sees only conflict, and hence peace or agreement would be mere fabrications, and enforced ones at that, a la Machiavelli. So that's sort of a Nietzschean thing, and thought comes into my head now about what that is. Ideas about peace and so on. World peace. What is world peace in a world of nations? When it comes to peace between people or within segments of a population, there can be real peace. There can be tolerance. There can be, let's say, if language refers to truth, then people can have things in common. But humanity is too large to be one. And so what is world peace? It's the biggest bully wins. That's honestly my slightly cynical streak on world peace. It's going to involve imperialism. It's basically the idea of world peace is an imperialist doctrine. You have to decide for the whole world what has to be done so that there will be no conflict. It's just one party has to decide everything. And, so there's something to that idea. But, that doesn't mean that peace isn't possible in any kind of form. But the idea would be some sort of Superman warrior ethic, which again is shared by, people like the let's say the globalists. That's sort of they're the Superman. They're gonna lay down the law. They're gonna be Sinai 2.0. They're gonna do it. So that's what I thought of. But the Superman has to be at peace with himself in order to be what he is. So why would we be worried if it's that simple? Why should we be worried about the conflict between priests and experts? And of course you could say Heidegger as well. It's being towards death, so there's always anxiety, but you don't have to be consistent. You just have to be adaptive, basically, to whatever demon comes into you next, or comes into the Superman next. Those gestures weren't funny at all. I'm sorry about that. So Strauss says that in order for this pervasive conflict to always exist, we must have both the anguish of relativism and the pangs of guilt that we receive from our spiritual suspicions. After all, if war is all there is, then that would pervade our nature too. But if we somehow feel regret over that, then there's something. There's a different kind of duality there. I said in my previous video that it's somewhat absurd to claim that our moral and spiritual needs exist without there being any way to satisfy them. This argument sounds a little bit similar to that observation. I don't want to put Bible-eves in Strauss's mouth, but I think it's an observation that makes sense. If you say that existence is only this, then how could this totally other thing be a part of human nature? And how would, if that's an absurdity, then how would that absurdity be intelligible? Because absurdity, I mean, you have to have a certain standard by which something is strange. It doesn't end. The confusion doesn't end if you choose this path. Don't do it. Just read Torah. But anyway, another point Strauss makes is basically that tolerance would only be one value without the power to demand sacrifice from coexisting values. If there's only conflict, why would tolerance, which is peace, be the imperative? Why not be an extremist? Because we're now stuck with these last men who preach duty or to curb absolutism for the sake of peaceful tolerance. But really, I said this before, they're as much of a bunch of bullies as the Nazis or the communists were, clamoring at their golden gates. We're basically all onto these people, but the question is whether there's a sane way to wipe away their silly system. If tolerance is possible, then it would be a reasonable ideal possible under certain circumstances, such as cultivated reason, for instance, or wealth, or a feeling of heterogeneity among the population. It doesn't matter what their demographic composition is. It doesn't matter. You just have to think like, I have something in common with these people. These people are Dutchmen, or these people are family. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, if people say that racism exists, if people say that our times are so totally, hopelessly polarized, I mean, my father, Jewish man, with a Dutch woman who has an African son, and we're like a unit, and we trust each other, and we have a good time with each other. It's people abstract from like a human dimension of life and common sense when they say that we have to wage a race war, one or the other, one way or another. I mean, in order to have peace, you have to understand. It must be according to reason. Please just listen to us. But for Weber, there's just that conflict, and one might say that in conflict, temporary victories are preferable to brooding tolerance. So again, why not be radical? Why not be consistent? Machiavelli, why not get things done? Bada bing, bada boom, capiche? But before Strauss talks about the nerve of the argument, there's a little footnote, which is that the general idea that Weber suggests is a kind of erotic worldview in a base sense that restores a kind of sexual relations as an escape from deadening modernity because it's natural and pleasant and passionate. That reminds you perhaps of some issue of ancient philosophy, but Aristophanes, namely, in some sense. I mean, I don't want to say that that's what Aristophanes is. That's something that Aristophanes uses, as how sex is this alarm bell of nature that reminds you that some of this other stuff might be nonsense, if he's correct. But in discussing the intellectual push for this idea, he proved that this insistence is only a new kind of specialism, namely psychology. It's just a new kind of reducing everything to sex. And, well, you think of that whatever you want. I know what I think. But first example is distributive justice, in terms of the nerve of the argument. The nerve of what Weber's methodology is and what's wrong with it. So that the first example is distributive justice. So Weber doesn't bother explaining aristocracy. Instead, he goes into Babeuf's argument for socialism. It's a silly and shallow argument that's cited as support for socialism. Now Strauss asks, how do you choose? If you don't know, his argument is something like, I didn't know about it either, it's something like, nature makes people unequal and we have to make people equal. It's just like so simple. I must be misunderstanding something. It can't be that simple. But now Strauss asks, how do you choose? Weber's relativism blocks one path. You can't choose one. And then his Kantianism blocks the other path, namely that, I don't know, there's some sort of ethical imperative or something. I didn't take that note down well enough. So I'm not sure why I'm bringing up Kant there. But the second example is the ethics of responsibility versus the ethics of intention. So Weber implies that the latter ultimately disconnects itself from whatever morals it founds itself on. Which is to say, it becomes sort of Gnostic or something. And Weber says that the responsibility plus intention is a complete human being. There's something to that. In fact, you could say that that's a kind of biblical perspective on it. But Strauss says that what Weber really means is that a conflict between certain religious precepts and plain politics exists, because he treats ethics of intention as something totally otherworldly. So the conflict, as you guessed it, is unsolvable. Then there's either the realm of intelligible, moral commandment, or there's Machiavelli on the other hand. And of course none of this Weber ever proved. And he doesn't want to anyway, because that's not his attitude as a social scientist. To him, revelation cannot be integrated into reason because it in some way opposes reason by being both not detached and also making claims that define reason and the reasoning mind. And apparently Weber went as far as to say that belief in revelation is ultimately absurdity, but Strauss, fortunately, does not think that. He says that there is such a thing as intelligent belief in the Bible, yay. Perhaps that's not what I'm doing, but it's possible, apparently. Just ask Leo Strauss. But I would say that taking reason as the only possible thing is ultimately absurd, and this whole chapter basically proves that. But Weber admits that this worldly science rests on faith too. Even the desire for truth itself, he cannot really justify. We talked about this before. I might have been in a previous episode. What kind of anthropology Weber has? If science is like the human thing, and human beings are knowers, and this is what we do. But how do you justify that idea? The desire for truth is something that has to be taken for granted. And I think that really is true. Ultimately, one has to take certain things for granted in order to live. It's just how it is. Only the difference between me and most people nowadays is that I have faith in an account that is transparent, intelligible, and consistent. Of course, it is in some ways the opposite of all these things when you get to the core of it, namely, it does defy reason, it goes beyond reason, but even this perplexity seems to be more intuitive than that of total emptiness, and there is a rational account for that, namely that we're talking about, okay, God lays down the law, we can understand that, we can think and talk about what God wants and who He is, even if we finally do not understand, because God is outside reality. God made reality, and we're in it, and so we can understand why there's like a gap there that we cannot cross. That's like understandable, and you can lay down with that. And in case of, if you take only reason, you have to lay down your mind at the point of what is thinking. The Bible goes a lot further. It takes you a lot further. And you could compare that to this Platonic argument as to why wisdom is the best pleasure. Because if you're wise, you understand the pleasure of money, you understand the pleasure of this and that. But if you're just an oligarch, you don't understand the pleasure of understanding something. It's just one argument. It's going to be rebutted. It's whatever. I'm just explaining you why I follow this way. And there's a reason for it. It's not just a preference. But for Weber and for most moderns, really, thought can discern realities only relevant to us. But he finally did not make this an absolute and imperative knowledge, as it is to most other moderns, even today. Scientism is strong these days. It's like a whole worldview, and this is what human beings do, apparently. But to him, this new attitude in science and philosophy is still... in science or philosophy, is still a historical phenomenon. that could be superseded by something else. And to the distress of many present-day modernists, or objectivists, really, that's what they are now. The people these days were really modern in the original sense. This is something that is in fact happening. Scientific truth is being pushed aside for the sake of agenda. Or if you are with the times, it's social progress, it's social justice. So in fact, Weber's proven right, is that some science is being superseded by something else. It's possible, and it's happening now. And people are having their rhetoric, and people are following that way, and it's happening en masse, and this is what it is. So all ideals then rest on faith, but we live in a faithless age, in a sense. So how the only faith that we have is invoked by rhetoric. So how do we preserve science, or whatever knowledge without which we cannot live? How do we discern or receive it? And there it is. There first gets brought up, Jerusalem and Athens. So what is being? That's the real question. What is the manner of existence? And how do we approach it? What is our place in it? How do we get to reality? And, I made previous videos about that. Whatever I was wrong about before, I have come to agree with Strauss that the conflict is unsolvable. It's a matter of whether there are several beings or only one, with a capital O. Is God in reality, or is reality in God? There's no compromise. But if you accept the existence of God, then you can still live a life of reflection. You can still think. In fact, you can think better. You have better reasons to think. You can serve God by thinking. You can serve God by studying the law. You can serve God by understanding His precepts, or producing good theological. Well, no, that's not actually true. Silence is probably best when it comes to those matters. But it's a good deed to teach. And look at all of the marvelous theological works from the Jewish sages to the church fathers. Also, if that's what you like. I mean, you could see that these people were students of both the Bible and philosophy, and they were trying to keep up with the signs of their times. I mean, it's all there. So these people were thinking men, but this is the thing: they knew what they wanted to think about. That's really the only thing. And then people say that that's a caveat, but really it's strength if you put it that way, because you have an idea of reality that you can build from. That's the thing. So I've come to think that reason is useless without revelation. I mean, reason has to be revealed. That's basically the thing. You have to know that there's reason. And Strauss says something similar. I mean, revelation can contain reason, but reason cannot contain either, really. It's what we've seen in this chapter. And perhaps this reminds you again of that Platonic argument with regard to which pleasure is best. So Weber is actually right. The denial of philosophy and science is the inevitable outcome of philosophy and science. And that calls back to this thing in the beginning of the chapter about, if you find the answer that there's no answers, then this will at least have been preceded by a question. So this is how it went for Weber. And again, Strauss here is well outside the confines of social science. He's just talking like a scientist, that's all. He's talking about big things here. So what about Weber's methodology? Do I have enough battery power for that? So Strauss says that it's philosophical in character, and see the earlier demand on the historical critique of natural right. He says there has to be true possibility of knowledge. Weber says no, and that's the foundation of this whole thing. So if science is true knowledge, then methodology is if science is the true way to knowledge, the methodology of science is dead serious epistemology. So if knowledge makes man, then proper science makes man. And so Weber thought that science consisted in a peculiar transformation of reality, which sounds interesting. Apparently that's a Kantian thing. I see some Hobbes in that. But what is reality as it is before that transformation? You get no answer from Weber. So Weber stuck with methodology. He just stuck with the human side of things. So he did not want social science to adopt the procedure of the natural sciences, yet he did not want the dualism of science to extrapolate into the idea of a metaphysical dualism with man working differently from the rest of nature. So meaning for man and cold silence from the celestial bodies and so on. So which is it? Is it all as one, or is it all as not one? So what is it? So the hint is that the causal explanation supersedes the interpretation, so reality isn't really fundamentally intelligible, but it's chaotic, and the only events and causes are knowable and not the reasons. So that is definitely in favor of the unity of the different methodologies, really. So the only reasons that exist are in the knower. And if you put that next to the idea that science is a transformation, you get basically, that's like Hobbes in a nutshell. So true knowledge is understanding of what we do and say because we are what we are. So there's a little bit of reality in there, but it's really just like true knowable causes are human causes. And that's the view of nature that Weber stuck with. And he resisted non-scientific discussion of reality for that reason. So common sense uses value judgments and so on, and it's historical and it changes and so on and so on. And so social science must think in comprehensive terms, viewing the totality of social life as man has always lived it, with all its different possible forms. I don't know whether it's Weber that says that or Strauss. Could be both, really. But Weber rejects common sense because of this so-called 3rd century tradition, or 3rd century tradition, which is the French Revolution plus the charisma thing, which states that common sense is a hybrid between subjective vision and public scientific knowledge. And Strauss connects this to the 17th century. I'm assuming he talks about Hobbes because this sounds so much like Hobbes, the stuff I said before. But it has to do with the new physics, apparently, which I don't know whether he talks about Descartes or Bacon or Laplace or whomsoever, which Strauss explains emancipated from and then became superordinate to philosophy, which is probably because of Machiavelli, which modernism adopted the whole view of like philosophy has to have some teeth, some nails. But then in the 19th century, says Strauss, it became clear that there was a difference between a common sense understanding of the natural world and a scientific one, and that the former preceded the latter. Namely, again, there's value judgments in the formation of scientific inquiries and so on. So, and my question is, how did that become clear? Who is he talking about here? The critique Strauss described is clearly existentialistic. It's, the common sense comes first, life comes first. The world is not theory but things. Peterson says stuff exactly like this. So Strauss is also smart to observe that our world of things is pervaded by concrete results of scientific theory. Hence, in order to understand common sense, we have to observe a form of it that preceded science. But Strauss wants to explain this in terms of the higher and not the lower. So he doesn't want to do anthropology, but he wants to study the essential premises of the Bible and classical philosophy. And that will let us understand the mindset within which the natural right tradition emerged. So you don't look at pottery, but you read the texts, okay? Do your homework, people. And I suppose it was natural that in this chapter about facts and values, one would encounter Jerusalem and Athens. The divisions sort of correspond, really. If you think about it, at least if you look through Max Weber's eyes. Facts are subject to reason, and values are beyond reason. That's basically the thing. And I do wonder about, where else he read about Jerusalem and Athens most. I still want to read Philosophy and Law. I just ordered On Tyranny, but I don't think I'll be reading that for a while. But I think the greatest insights in this chapter, in closing, really do revolve around that fundamental question of whether or how we can grasp reality. And I spoke plenty about that. So I'm going to close here and wish you all a good evening and a good weekend, a good Sabbath. I'm going to lie down. I'm going to make a lot of nice food. I'm going to chill. I'm going to hopefully not have this cold anymore so I can continue working. And I'm going to try and draw a little, maybe, or wind down, do whatever. So have a good evening, people, and I'll see you again next time.